In our last lesson, we took a look at the scale that affects how we see ourselves as success, and we broke it down. And one of the things that we were doing is we were seeing where it came from and why that scale affects us the way it does. It's the beginning of amplified mediocrity, because when we measure ourselves, we're measuring ourselves against a scale that doesn't really belong to us. And so part of the reason why we are affected by that scale is because of something that we begin to look at as risk or caution. See, that scale affects everything we do. We measure ourselves. What we say is, hey, if I do certain things, I'll get certain results. And if I don't do certain things, I won't get those results. And so we begin to bound what risk we'll take. And that risk, that boundary that risk falls within, that's caution. And so the name of this lesson is Caution and Risk Are Curious Allies. You see, our scales were primarily shaped by some experiences that were a bit traumatic. When we stepped out of line, we got in trouble. And stepping out of line, often for the right reasons, is very important. You don't want your child to burn their hand on the hot stove, so you give them a warning. Well, in this lesson, as we learn about caution and risk, we're going to learn about how some of those warnings really weren't meant for us to use later in life. Like we talked about before with the scale, caution and risk are curious allies because once we understand them and how they work, we can begin to assess how they've been keeping us in amplified mediocrity. And what we want is for a caution and risk to keep us out of harm's way, but to allow us to use our minds most effectively and most creatively. And that's the difference between caution and risk under amplified mediocrity versus caution and risk as a brazen creative. See, I know what my extreme sport is. In fact, I'm a very strange bird because my extreme sport is what scares almost every person on the planet, public speaking. That's one of the main fears people have anywhere in the world. It's measured over and over in study after study. I was not born into public speaking. In fact, as a child, I was introverted and self-conscious. Now, here's what's funny. I went to the Air Force Academy and they said, Bryant, you better sound off. Now, what that means is speak with the voice of authority, but sometimes louder than you thought you could ever speak. You have to be clearly heard across what seems like miles. And so when you learn to speak with the voice of authority, when you learn to sound off, you can cut through the chatter of a tense situation, but I was not born into that. I had to learn it. And when I learned it, I began to change who I was. I had no idea that I could be that loud. I had no idea that I could be that boisterous. And I certainly didn't know that by just changing how I used my voice, I would go from a shy, introverted child to an extrovert, to someone who would embrace speaking in public. Caution and risk changed for me in that moment when I began to see the power of my voice. And I'm hoping that once you understand caution and risk, you'll be willing to take some risks and change the way you see caution that will help you break out of amplified mediocrity as you journey toward brazen creativity. Let's get started, shall we? There are 4 things that I identify as limiting factors that help us see caution and risk the way we do. And because these limiting factors exist in the space and time of our mind, we think they're very important. So what I'm going to do is break down these 4 areas. There may be more, but I'm going to use these 4 as the framework to break down amplified mediocrity and the caution and risk associated with it. In fact, these 4 limb facts affect our scale. And I say limb fact, that's limiting factor, and that's a term for the military. The military knows limiting factors as things that either cause me to do certain things, behave a certain way, or they prevent me from behaving a certain way. What we need to understand is when we break down these 4 limiting factors or limb facts, we'll begin to see that they affect how we see ourselves, and therefore, because they're limiting factors, they help us behave in a certain way, they actually keep us mired in amplified mediocrity. Let's get started on the first one. That is the environment. The environment is really something amazing to me because the environment is not fixed, but we often believe it is. You're thinking of the environment just like I did, the trees and the grass, the soil and all the plants and animals that go into the natural habitat. But look inside your home. When you were a child, the very first environment that was created for you outside of home, outside of nature, was kindergarten or preschool. And if you go into that place, you would see letters and words and books and art supplies. And how could a child not want to create or read or learn in an environment that was surrounded by, that was full of things that made you want to learn? When you're 4 or 5 years old, the world is at your disposal. You're going to figure out how to learn. You're going to create and draw and paint. And you're going to be this most amazing creative creature, because the environment is rich with creative tools, books to learn. And they would spend, remember when you were in kindergarten? I know I do. One of my favorite times was story time. The teacher would read to us. Think about the environment that you were being read to in kindergarten, how rich it was. You're surrounded by the alphabet. You've got letters and numbers everywhere. You've got words: cat, dog, rat, boy, girl, drum. All these words are all around you. It's amazing how rich that environment was. And when we think about our environment today, how sterile is our environment? It can be really something quite different than that. But see, that's an engineered environment. Unlike nature, which is outside the door, and we can't really control that. Inside the door, we can. So the question that I have for you is your environment a limiting factor? Have you created an environment that, like that kindergarten or preschooler, is rich with learning opportunities and growth? Or is it keeping you in amplified mediocrity because it's engineered for you to stay right where you are? When we look at our environment, we're going to look at it in 3 very basic areas that will help us kind of dissect this limiting factor of environment. The first area is, look at the people who taught you about your environment. Did they teach you to create the environment, to shape it yourself very deliberately? Or did they teach you that what you do is dictated by the environment? Like, you're either sort of a victim of the environment or you're a creator of the environment. Most of us were taught, like I was talking about with preschool and kindergarten, that the environment is. Here's the funny part. Once we learn from the people who taught us, learn about the people who taught us about the environment, we can begin to kind of dissect why they created the environment that way in the first place. A kindergarten teacher wants their children to be fertile minds, to learn and learn and learn and learn and grow in their capacity to learn more. But maybe when you get to high school, the teacher wants to create the environment to keep you in your seat and to keep you in control or be controlled. The difference in the person who teaches you how to create your environment is the difference of the purpose of that environment. The second thing you'll talk about is that I want to talk about in the environment is the people or points of view that you introduce into that environment, right? So if we start with the first part, where it's the environment itself and who taught us to engineer the environment and the purpose behind that engineering, the second one is the points of view that come into our environment. You see, our environment isn't just physical, isn't just the walls and the ceiling and the floor, but the engineered environment are the people we invite into it and their points of view or their perspectives. So sometimes we want to feel comfortable, so we invite people who agree with us politically or religiously. We invite people into our environment who, like, if I don't drink much, I don't want to be around people who drink all the time. If I don't smoke much, I don't want to be around people who smoke a lot. See, if we are shaping our environment, we're going to shape our environment based on the points of view or the perspectives that make us feel good or comfortable. And often, because we shape our environment the way we do, we can hold caution and risk at bay. We can keep them in this limited channel or environment, this limited area that allows us to stay inside amplified mediocrity. We're not going to challenge ourselves by the people or points of view or perspectives that we bring into our environment. The third area that we need to look at is the purpose behind the environment itself. Why is this environment created? I actually inhabit the surroundings that I create, whether it's at home or at work, at church. It's a stark lesson to understand that I see my environment as something that is happening to me, and I am happening to it. The environment is interactive in my world. But before, when I didn't see it that way. I didn't have a purpose for the environment. The environment it was fixed. It just was, is. And I didn't see it as something that kept me in amplified mediocrity or helped me break out of it. As a Brazen creative, one of the things we'll do is create an environment that is lush with learning opportunities, challenging our normal ways of thinking. We want an environment that encourages us to accept risk, that gets us closer to what we say we want based on the scale we're constantly working on, not the scale that someone handed to us, but the one we create for ourselves, and reject the risk that we know won't get us to where we say we want to go. The problem with this is if you are clearly defining your environment, you begin to introduce things that are necessarily foreign, and foreign things can often be uncomfortable. And so one of the foreign things that we are going to introduce into our environment is how we define problems, which is the second limiting factor, or lim fac. The second limiting factor is how we define problems in the first place, because one of the reasons we define problems is to tap into the resources we believe we have at our disposal. I won't define a problem that's impossible to solve. I'll define a problem that is possible for me to solve. And the problem is, if my environment was engineered in a way that keeps me in amplified mediocrity, guess how I'll define a problem? Because the resources I use to solve a problem are usually the ones that are in my environment in the first place. So if my environment is creating a comfort for me, if the environment doesn't challenge my intellectual or social comfort zone, then guess what's going to happen when I define a problem that I need to solve? I will not define the problem that stretches me and gets me out of my comfort zone, that gets me out of amplified mediocrity. And if I don't define a problem properly, solving it's not going to be any more innovative or creative than the problem definition in the first place. The limiting factor of defining a problem, the second of the four we're going to talk about, is that we are already in amplified mediocrity defining the problem. So our problem definition doesn't really stretch our creative thinking. And if the problem definition doesn't, I guarantee you, when we look at the third and fourth limiting factors, we won't ever get out of amplified mediocrity. See, caution and risk are curious allies because they work together. Caution is the boundary, risk is what's inside that boundary. And so when we start looking at caution, let's look at it like our forebears did back before we were very civilized. When we were in the jungle or in the steppe, we had to face the lion or the tiger or the bear. The funny part is that our forebears would see the lion or tiger and they would accept or reject a risk associated with a decision. Do I fight or run? The ones that solved that problem best taught their children how to solve that problem best too. Sometimes you fight the bear, sometimes you run from the bear. The risk is knowing which way to go. Caution is, uh-oh, bear. Risk is, do I run? Can I outrun this bear? Or do I fight it? And if I fight it, am I going to win? Or am I going to hold it at bay long enough for the people around me to run? Risk and caution go hand in hand. And our forebears perceived danger knowing that they would have to solve this problem. And that's how caution was created in that context. Caution is walk into a dark cave. There might be something in there that could eat me. Risk is knowing once you see it, what to do. Do I accept the risk to fight? Or do I accept the risk to flee? Or do I reject the risk to fight and flee? Or do I reject the risk to flee and fight? That risk and that caution, they go hand in hand. And they're curious allies because in today's modern era, we kind of freak out about risk. We freak out about things that are stressful but may not kill us. See, danger should be mortal danger, i.e. the lion or the bear or the tiger, the snake. But your boss, your job, your bills, they're not mortal dangers. They feel stressful. I am not saying they're not. I have had the crushing weight of debt on me for most of my adult life. I get it. I would sweat as to how I would pay all those bills, but those bills, if they don't get paid, don't kill me. They don't eat my heart. They don't rip my arm off. But they do stress us out. So we want to be able to discern the difference between caution and risk that's mortal danger and caution and risk that's keeping us in amplified mediocrity. The third limiting factor, or lim fac, that I want to describe to you has to do with how we look at resources. The resources that we call to solve a problem. In the first limiting factor, we talked about the environment, and we broke that down into 3 areas. Who taught us to engineer our environment? And we looked at the environment very clearly from those 3 areas so that we would understand how the environment affects how we see caution and risk. The second we talked about was we took a look at the way we define a problem. And the way we define a problem is very frustrating, because when we are mired in amplified mediocrity, we define a problem looking at the resources that we have at our disposal from the environment. The third thing we look at is the actual resources themselves. And here's the funny part about resources. When you look at them, when you see resources, they are what they are. So for some, resources are opportunities to be creative. For others, they're just what they are. So in the case that I'm trying to describe to you, when you see resources as a brazen creator versus mired in amplified mediocrity, you begin to see things with a different lens. You can turn them upside down and flip them back and forth. You can see a paper clip as a corkscrew, and not just as a way to clip two pieces of paper together. You can see a knife as a screwdriver. You can see a nail, perhaps, as a way to bond two pieces of wood, or as a toothpick. These things are because we see our resources differently. The way we describe and use resources is a direct result of caution and risk. Don't do that, we've been told. It's not for that, we've been told. There are people who are really creative and innovative, people who use household chemicals to build all sorts of cool experiments for their kids to play with in chemistry. But for most of us, household chemicals, flour and sugar, vinegar are just things to cook with. But I bet if you're in certain situations, you begin to see these different household chemicals, these different household tools, the staples in your cabinet, as solutions to problems. But first you have to define the problem, and then you have to look at the resources that are to solve the problem. And the way we look at resources is a limiting factor, because they determine what caution and risk lanes we stay in and which ones we get out of. The last limiting factor is one that's a little bit harder to describe, so I'm going to go into it just a little bit more in detail. All right, my first book will start with a sparkle. The sparkle in Start with a Sparkle is the sparkle in your eye. It's the reason why we get up, and it's what I call ikigai. It's a Japanese word that means the reason you wake up in the morning. And the reason why this is important, because in our limiting factors, the fourth limiting factor is your sparkle, your purpose, the reason why you exist, the reason why you wake up. And if you see yourself as a cog in a machine and you wake up every morning fitting that machine, you forget that you are unique and creative and powerfully original. And because of that, we temper caution and risk. We box it in. When we begin to see ourselves through the lens of ikigai, the reason why we wake up, the way we see problems, the way we solve problems, the way we see resources begins to change unbelievably. But it's scary because it's hard to take a look at who you are as the first step in the process. So I call it a limiting factor, because if we see ourselves as a cog in a machine versus as a unique creature, as someone capable of having great intellectual and creative input into a situation, we will bound ourselves through caution and risk accordingly. If I am the hero of my own story, if I'm having a moment of epic presence where I am the most important person in my own storyline, then I will act accordingly. But if I'm just a background player in the story that I write of myself, I'm probably going to miss an opportunity to give my creativity to the situation. And it's scary, because we've been told, if you remember, in kindergarten, the scale of what is good: don't step out of line, don't speak out of turn, don't sit in the wrong seat, don't. And all these don'ts add up to how we see ourselves in the process. And so the limiting factor is our sparkle. Do we embrace it, or do we sort of reject it? And when you look at the four limiting factors together, you see caution and risk in a whole new light. Caution and risk are curious allies, because when there's mortal danger, they help us navigate. We want that. We want to be able to navigate mortal danger. It's not natural to jump out of an airplane when you're untrained. It is natural to jump out of an airplane when you understand how a parachute works. Mortal danger can be redefined by how we look at the environment. And once we understand that, we can begin to break down those four limiting factors. The four being the environment and how we see it and engineer it, the people who taught us about that, the purpose of the environment itself, we look at the second of those 4 limiting factors, we begin to understand that the problem has to be defined outside the boundaries of what we consider normal, because our old normal was amplified mediocrity. So the problem definition definitely was going to be mediocre, and therefore the solutions that we call forth are going to be mediocre. The third limiting factor are the resources we have at our disposal. And what we've been taught is if we have an extraordinary problem, we need extraordinary resources. What I'm here to tell you is that you may have extraordinary resources at your disposal if you look at them through a different lens. Amplified mediocrity says use the tool as it's designed. But the Brazen Creative knows that there are rules to that that can be broken, bent, or reshaped altogether. It's up to us in the looking at the fourth limiting factor, or limfac, to really assess if we're motivated by our sparkle or not. Our ikigai is so important to us. It's the animating presence that allows us to craft a solution that's wicked cool, or plain old plain. And these 4 limiting factors are, for me, an understanding of caution and risk in a whole new light. As I told you before, I was not born as a public speaker. I was not born as someone who embraced the thrill of standing in front of hundreds or thousands of people to do what I do, but I love it. It's a joy for me. And I call it my extreme sport because I'm not one to jump out of airplanes or off bridges with bungee cords, or, I do ski, but I don't ski the most crazy downhill slopes. I ski very gentle slopes because I enjoy the shush versus the thrill of cliffs, avalanches, and the things that black diamond skiers go through. My whole measure of success changed when I began to see myself in a whole new light. The external factor of going to the Air Force Academy and having to sound off changed how I saw caution and risk. It was because I was here and I was saying, I am not going to stand out and be loud. And then they said, you don't have a choice, Cadet Bryant. You will be loud. So I opened my mouth, took a lungful of air, and I began to sound off. And I found my voice. And that voice began to carry across the terrazzo at the Air Force Academy, for those who know it. And it would bounce off the buildings all the way back to me. And I said, wow, my voice is loud. And people would turn their heads because I was so loud. And I began to see caution and risk differently, because before, don't say anything, be quiet, be cautious, be careful. It's too risky to say loud things. By the end of my 4 years as a cadet at the Air Force Academy, I was a fantastic public speaker, one of the best in my class. And that turnaround came because someone challenged me to redefine caution and risk, like I'm doing with you. In this lesson, we've gone through 4 limiting factors. And as I said before, we will always end each lesson with 5 reflection questions. And those questions are designed to get you to think. So today, I've asked you to go through this with me and understand caution and risk as curious allies. I'm going to give you 5 questions to think about. And then as you think about those questions, I want you to consider that caution and risk help you in mortal danger and hurt you in amplified mediocrity. I cannot tell you where the line is between the two. Only you can. But the point is, I want you to begin to define that line based on what truly is mortal and dangerous, and what truly is just stressful, but makes you feel like it's mortal danger. There is no lion in your office. There is no bear or tiger in your office. I know it feels that way sometimes because I had that boss that made me not want to come to work every day. And those days, I understood. It felt like there was a bear in my office about to rip my arm off, but yet, no matter how bad that boss was, my arms stayed attached. Here are your 5 questions to answer in your journal before you proceed. Take your time. Listen to what I'm asking you to think about, and then think about it. Take a whole day. When was the last time you were in a fiery, passionate battle? Why did you choose to fight that battle? What was the result of that engagement? And if you can't answer that question, why haven't you been in a fiery, passionate battle that you can remember? Is that something you're proud of? 2, look at your environment. Quickly assess it. Does it inspire you? If yes, to do or be what? If not, why not? Does it help you focus on a goal or relax after a hard day? Does it remind you of a pleasant time in your life? Or does it represent a level of achievement that you pursued? 3, identify the last time you consciously assessed caution and risk in your personal life. How did it turn out? Did you accept the right risk and get the reward? Or reject the wrong risk and avoid a terrible consequence? 4, what was the last problem that truly engaged all your problem-solving prowess? How long ago was that? What resources did you call to solve the problem? Did you have to learn something new? Last question, number 5. Jot down your sparkle in one sentence and review that. If you could make enough money to live on that thing that you jotted down as your sparkle, would you? Would you change jobs? And why would you? Or why won't you? I'll see you next lesson.